Okay, so looks like we can just go ahead and get it started. So welcome everyone to the Impacted Community panel. Today we're very happy to have our wonderful panelists here. Before that, let me first say a few words about this particular panel. So this Impacted Community panel, we're very interested in discussing information related to how data science affects the impacted community, especially people of color. And we're very excited about understanding various of the opportunities and challenges in research along this domain. For example, how is data science, what are the implications of biased data, and what does the data affect Black, Hispanic, Asian communities, and also how we're able to understand the implications, right, of machine learning and AI techniques on this different communities. We're interested in understanding how these academia and social, opportunities, and also how we actually understand, the fundamental challenges along this line of research. And I think the goal is to certainly discuss various of aspects of research and also educational opportunities along this line, and to hope, right, that we're able to improve the diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, right, of our data science community. And let me first introduce the co-chair of today's panel. So Professor Sharon Tettegah, who is a professor of Black Studies at UCSB, and also she is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Right now, she's also director of the Center for Black Studies and Research. So Sharon, please say a few words.
Thank you so much, William. I am so excited about this panel today, and I want to thank all of the panelists, and definitely you, William, for being the co-chair with me on this panel on impacted communities. I welcome everyone who's here today. I wish I could be there, so I apologize for not being able to be there physically, but I know this is going to be an amazing panel. And again, thank you to Michaela, who helped to coordinate all of this, and all of her staff, Steve. It's been a wonderful experience. And thank you all. And again, thank you, panelists, and thank you, William, for just doing this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Let me introduce today's panelists. So we will start with Faithe. So Faithe has her PhD in communication studies from University of Michigan. And before that, she also had a background in English and digital humanities. She has done a lot of influential work in the area of social media, understanding digital humanities and their impact on this related communities. And Faithe is also currently a postdoc at UCSB in the Center for Black Studies and Research. So welcome, Faithe. Next, let me introduce Tony. Tony Baylis is right now at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and he's now serving as the lab's director in the Office of Strategic Diversity and Inclusion Programs. In this position, he's in the senior management advocating diversity and inclusion for the lab. Welcome, Tony. And the next, let me introduce you Safiya Noble, who is an internet studies scholar and professor of gender studies and African American studies at UCLA. And she's been doing a lot of work in this area of understanding critical internet inquiries, and she's also the co-founder and co-director of UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiries. And before this particular panel, I actually talked to Safiya, and I want to again congratulate her for her wonderful achievement last year getting the MacArthur Fellowship, which is really amazing. So welcome and congratulations. And next we have Francisco Marmolejo-Cossío, who is a postdoc at Harvard. Before that, he's also did his PhD in Harvard in theoretical computer science. And I get to know Francisco from his work engaged in this mechanism design for social good. I've been talking to many different people in that community. They've been doing very influential work understanding, how do we change, right, the algorithmic design and how do we improve algorithmic design for research along this line. So welcome, Francisco. So to start, I would like to, maybe go around the table to have our panelists say a few words about themselves, the work they've been doing at their institution, and also, how you feel like, right, as, you're working in this area, what's your experience working with and working on the topics related to impacted community?
Sure. Well, thank you, Will. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everyone, for having. It's wonderful to be here. It's the first time I attend ADSA, and I think in my current work with MD4SG, I think is what most relates to the conversations that I've been seeing at this meeting, where we're an interdisciplinary. For those of you who may not have seen MD4SG before. We're an interdisciplinary group of mostly junior-led researchers who are working with the expressed desire to help historically marginalized communities have access to opportunity. And in that capacity, I've been involved with MD4SG now for 3-4 years. First, helping coordinate specific research groups on topics of interest. Previously, I was involved with the development working group. Now I help organize the initiative as a whole. And I help a lot with outreach initiatives. So I've done a lot of work reaching out to Latin America, where I'm from, and we've begun some research groups that are focused on the Latin American region, but on also integrating individuals, both linguistically and culturally, to the work that we do in this sphere that tends to have this influence on these communities that we impact with the techniques that we look at. So in that sense, it's been really eye-opening to be here to learn about a lot of the systemic work that goes on behind the scenes in the creation of the programs. I mean, as a postdoctoral fellow, it's something that I still get glimpses and pieces of kind of the administration that goes on behind the scenes, and seeing this concerted effort to try and make the space that much more inclusive, both at the research, at the pedagogical, and even at the communication level with the communities that we work with, is a wonderful thing to see. And it's something that we've been pushing for at MD4SG, but I would love to see ways that we can collaborate and push this further, both from the junior focus that we have, but also from the more senior and academic, administrative perspective that is taken here. And so in that sense, thank you. I guess it's a little bit more about the stuff I do related to this, but I'm very excited to talk more on this panel.
Great. It's really a pleasure to be here. I feel especially honored because I think about all of the people who touch us, many of us, many of my colleagues here, and just the way in which this conversation has evolved so much over the last decade about the impact of data, and that data could even impact marginalized people. And I say that because probably 10 years ago, when I was a grad student, I'm looking here at Professor Tettegah, who was on my dissertation committee, and she still manages to not age. I need the products, Sharon. 10 years ago, trying to argue that data was political, that it was socially constructed, that it could be operationalized through algorithms and artificial intelligence. That was a mostly illegible conversation. And we didn't have conferences in this way that we do now that were really giving us space to talk about the harms that can come from the datafication of everyday life, and especially in ways that are banal that we kind of don't give a second glance at. So I started working in this area. I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the information school there. And I was thinking about the future of knowledge for communities of color. I was in a library science, for the most part, program. And it was at the time that Google was becoming kind of a household name, if you will. This was 2008, 2009, 2010. And We were in the throes of a massive, as many of you know, and some of you may have even participated in, this kind of massive datafication, digitization of millions of volumes of knowledge that was kind of being led by academic university libraries. It was the Google Book Digitization Project. And I was thinking about the implications of the future of knowledge for communities of color whose knowledge is not already collected and curated, oftentimes in academic libraries, for whom our struggle to even have our epistemologies known in the world is still difficult, and that this kind of digitization of knowledge would serve as a basis for machine learning algorithms that Google was cultivating at the time and still is. And of course, those processes informing their kind of natural language processing technologies today. And to talk about that process was harmful and that its technologies like search technology and then eventually YouTube and other kinds of products was dangerous to communities of color, dangerous to society, was really just very, very difficult to make legible. I can tell you that, and Sharon knows this, it was very difficult to find 4 people to be on a dissertation committee that would support these kinds of ideas. And now, of course, what we have is irrefutable evidence of the harms of AI and algorithmically driven systems, and not just dirty data, but the kind of surveillance state that we all are living under around the world. There's irrefutable evidence that tremendous harm comes from these kinds of projects. And so I've been in this conversation for about a decade, really trying to foreground the vulnerable people for whom these technologies are experimented upon. So much so that I think the conversation for me has really shifted in the last 10 years from thinking about how is it that Black girls and women are so profoundly misrepresented in search and different kinds of large-scale digital media platforms, to thinking about what does it mean when Black women and women of color are noticing the most harmful dimensions of different types of tech applications because they are experimented upon in our communities and upon us, and what kind of threat that is when it gets extended to other communities around the world and in fact becomes part of the logic of kind of collapsing democracy as we know it. And I would argue now and do that the lack of regulatory frameworks, the divestment from education, from higher education, from public media, public libraries, kind of the public goods that we need in service of pouring billions of dollars into technical solutions, if you will, to social problems, is part and parcel of the problem. So I've started thinking at UCLA, at our Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, about things like what would it mean if we didn't use the word data and we were much more descriptive with words like data, so that if we are talking about, in more explicit terms, we could say, instead of saying like, what's the data collected on children in schools, we might say, to what degree do we monitor and log every single action by children and then use it to predict whether they're going to have a future or not? You know, those are the kinds of things, like these ways in which we can make visible the word data in lots of different contexts, especially as they touch vulnerable people, that I think will really give us a tremendous amount of power to then intervene, as you talked about in your work. So these are the kinds of things that I'm working on and thinking about right now at UCLA, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today.
Great. Thanks, and I appreciate being invited to be a part of this panel and also getting to work with such great people at UCSB, like Dr. Wang and Dr. Tettegah. And I love that Safiya kind of set up this understanding of this idea that 10 years ago there wasn't a lot of discussion about the ethics of algorithms and things like discriminatory design, because when I was doing my research, in particular when I was writing my dissertation, I was at the University of Michigan in communication studies, and I was a real, I guess, techno-utopian, you could say. I was very excited about the potential that the digital media platforms, in particular thinking about Google and YouTube, as these spaces that were going to allow content creators, and in particular content creators that came from intersectionally marginalized communities, to finally be able to have their work recognized. And so I was excited, starting my dissertation, working on things like YouTube web series and thinking about how YouTube was going to revolutionize television. And so I started to collect data around not only the comments and the conversations that people were having within that space, but also the video content. However, as I got towards the end of my research, I started to realize that despite the fact that I studied web series, that I was working with a lot of other people who studied web series and people who were a part of the communities of mostly Black, queer, and trans people who were creating these series, that none of us were ever recommended this content via the YouTube algorithm. We were not seeing it. We had to sort of find it amongst ourselves. And so I began to dig a bit more deeply into how YouTube's recommendation system works, the way that Google engineers were actually constructing the algorithm, and began to realize that because of the ways that the algorithm was constructed based on popularity, things like view counts, likes, et cetera, that a lot of the content that should be getting recognized, that should be getting promoted within these spaces, these new spaces that were supposed to change television, we're actually hiding that content. We're actually dismissing that content in favor of more popular videos. And so I always say that my dissertation took a turn at that point and began to be a lot more critical about these different platforms and beginning to analyze why was it that the algorithm was working this way, and what did it mean, if we are using technology and creating platforms as this means of making social progress and also creating a more equitable society, if they're not actually doing that by design. And so from that, I began to get more interested in data science work. And so after I left Michigan, I took on particular postdoctoral fellowships that really focused on the relationship between diversity and data science. And most recently, before I was at UCSB, I accepted a fellowship at Purdue to work on African American data curation. And a lot of that particular fellowship, which was from the Council on Library and Information Resources, was really thinking about what does Black studies bring to data science. So for those of us who have worked with intersectionally marginalized communities and know the theories and the methods of understanding those communities, what does that bring to actually understanding the way that technologies are created, the way that algorithms are created, and also being able to uncover these systems? Because many times, of course, they're hidden within these black boxes because we don't really know how the technology works. And so during my work with CLEAR, I created something that was called the Black Living Data Booklet, which is a part of a lot of the digital humanities projects that are created, which really focus on thinking about how to inform researchers, students, and community members about how platforms work. And so promoting things like data literacy, but also media literacy, as well as contextualizing those things in a history. And so I always talk about, we discuss a lot of the times data collection and data science is something that's happening within the 21st century. But in my work, I like to trace it all the way back to the 17th and 18th century. So thinking about things like scientific racism, eugenics theory, and how the way that data has been collected on intersectionally marginalized communities actually reinforces all types of deficit narratives that continue to play out even into the future. So uniting both the past, the present, and the future in our discussions of how we think about data. And so a lot of that work now has culminated into my position here at UCSB, or in UCSB, at the Center for Black Studies Research, where I am a research mentor and guide in, as you see, SEEDS, as Dr. Tettegah so proudly presents, Student Engagement and Enrichment in Data Science program. And that program really focuses on thinking about how do we look at data and the value that data can potentially bring to Black communities, in particular thinking about how can we get students from across disciplines to have a better understanding of not only data as a thing that has a lot of potential that can actually help us in terms of making social progress, but also thinking about the harmful effects of data within society. So teaching students things like data ethics, having them understand how different types of platforms work, and also thinking about what role they can potentially play within the industry. What types of employment opportunities do they have available to them? What types of research can they learn how to do, and the types of projects that they can create? And so currently at this moment in time, I'm working on a new project that's really focused on what I call counter-platforming strategies. So now that I know how the algorithm of YouTube works, I've really been applying that knowledge actually to the way that the TikTok algorithm works and the way that censorship algorithm works in particular, and thinking about how content where people are talking about things like gender, race, sexuality, et cetera, are many times barred in that platform because of the fact that TikTok flags words like Black and women and queer and trans, et cetera, et cetera. And so my students and me have been working on creating these resources that we call it the Platform Project that shows how can we actually engage with these platforms in ways that are allowing us to kind of signal boost that type of content, signal boost the social justice work that people are doing online, and also the work that they're doing in terms of giving more visibility to intersectionally marginalized communities, but also thinking about informing the public about the way that these different algorithms work. And so that's been kind of my main focus in the past year or so, and how I really came into thinking about impacted communities.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Sharon and William, for the invitation. And as you heard, I'm the director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And part of our efforts at the laboratory, as well as the Department of Energy, is one of 17 national laboratories underneath the umbrella of Department of Energy. And as a result of the work that we are trying to do, which is to really uplift the awareness that you were talking about for students, especially students that are underserved. It's not only the students, but also reaching out to faculty that are out there and the academic community to see how we can basically leverage each other to basically build a more informed society, centered around how we can help this progression for our work that we're doing from a national security perspective that has impact, and impact that basically informs, shapes, and helps us elevate the knowledge base of everyday citizens, quite frankly. Sharon invited me based on the fact that I've been the only one in the room. I know a number of colleagues from 30 years of history of working in data viz, and serve today as a diversity, equity, inclusion person for ACMC Graph. I also sit on a number of boards and such that really focuses in on underserved communities. So basically the High Performance Computing Conference to supercomputing, to actually sitting on a board that's talking about this science underrepresentation in actually theater and how you basically sort of uplift and sort of inform, the general public around these topics that my colleagues here are talking about. This is really a wonderful sort of landscape that we need to actually work toward more. And you're seeing it more and more in the news today, is really trying to have this understanding around what does data mean, how does it basically impact or serve basically those communities that have been basically lost for a long, long time and didn't quite understand. Right now, I'm trying to work with my colleague Jason Black and building his consortium on HBCUs around data science and trying to figure out how we could basically really make sure that even communities in academia aren't left out in the conversation as it pertains to funding, as it pertains to just being noticed. And it doesn't have to be just HBCUs. So there's other minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, Native American tribes as well as part of that. The TCUs and others are all basically working toward trying to have a position in this space. How do we help them? How do we basically bring them into the fold that basically works toward them being and feeling that they belong in this actual community? So we have to build trust. We have to build a lot of relationships around, what it is we're trying to do and achieve. And then how do we basically make it so that we really position young people who may have an interest in this space, understanding it. Because right now they don't necessarily understand it. And yes, more and more of them are beginning because of social media platforms like TikTok and others, because people are talking about it. They're talking about how to actually get your, video seen, right? And they're talking about the algorithm, so more and more students and young people are becoming more interested in this space. We can actually build effective programs to actually enhance and to have them basically be a participant, an active participant in this space. So I really think that impacted communities of color, especially, and women, can basically be that voice for us, quite frankly, to really move our society in a more positive direction. And I know at our laboratory, we're very interested in this as well. And I would say this administration as well is trying to build equity into the space more and more. And if we can help with that by having small communities like this to really sort of elevate the awareness, the knowledge, and the conversation, then I think that's a plus in the right direction for the society as a whole.
Thank you, everyone, for starting with all this very important comments or thoughts. I'll start off with some moderator questions, and then Sharon, feel free to jump in. And towards the last half an hour, then we'll very happy to open the floor for questions so we can have more interactions. One thing that I've been thinking throughout this morning is definitely we are seeing the impacts, right? So for example, speech recognition. There are actually well-documented studies for the African American community. The average accuracy is way lower than some other communities. So that I think we're seeing this, impact, and a lot of people trying to collect data to improve, right? For example, accuracy for speech recognition for different communities, but what are some, risks, right, along this line? So when you're collecting data, in what way it may actually harm this vulnerable population, right, then we're trying to help. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about your experience working with this impacted community, and how can we improve our, let's say, protocols or processes when we're collecting data, when we're working with them?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about so some experience that I have in this area, and I must say that for me it's been an interesting path because I began my research in a much more theoretical ilk, and over the past, through MD4SG and through some work over the past 3-4 years, it's been shifting towards these very real, very important pressing problems for all of us that, thanks to the work that everyone here is doing, has become much more present and salient for us to study. And I do certain work with resource allocation in marginalized communities in Mexico with marginalized educational institutions over the course of COVID, where we've been looking at questions such as if there are limited resources such as COVID tests, how do we allocate these COVID tests in a principled way that serves the community? That what is the purpose of this resource? So first having that conversation with the community of, this is the problem at hand, and the problem itself came from conversations with the community. So there's this limited resource at hand that we would like to think of how to use in a more principled way. How do we do so? And so the first part of that learning process for us is, then I was a PhD student of bringing together PhD students and researchers from Oxford to talk with these schools in Mexico, of just talking about, the test itself can serve as either a means of preventing infection as it spreads under perhaps some stochastic model, or it can serve as maybe a certificate of health so that people can attend day-to-day activities and get some sort of utility from being able to access the laboratory for some experiment, and kind of breaking things down and also learning from their perspectives has helped us mitigate a lot of the potential impacts that could happen further down the line. And I will say that another thing that has been really important for us has been perpetually having this conversation open with the students, with the policymakers, and learning through the implementation process. And one of the things that we began noticing immediately is that whatever optimization or algorithmic approach we might want to take should definitely strongly be seen as a supplement to whatever true human cases are currently being seen in the school at hand. So us as kind of learning in the process, we toned back many of the things that we had initially tried to model, turned everything into much more of a recommendation system for different trade-offs, so that ultimately the power of the decision at the end of the day was in the policymakers who were looking at the true realities that they had at hand. And so really that interplay, that back and forth, and I think this speaks a lot to the really wonderful talk that we had by earlier today by Desmond, where I think the entire pipeline, how can we integrate the community throughout the entirety of the pipeline? And it's wonderful work to see in the data collection portion of it. Certainly we have innovations like what we saw before with the annotators that we were looking at, but how can we also incorporate communities in the actual algorithmic process of things? And one thing that we're looking at is pedagogical innovations as well. We want to empower and create trust in these communities, the trust that these communities have in the tools that we look at. So things such as something as simple as a workshop with the students of the high school that we're looking at, where we teach some of the basic methods that are potentially going to go into the processes that are going to inform the decisions that policymakers might take, and to give them certain ownership on the 2.0 implementation of this. If it's garbage, then give them the power to scrap this entirely, and to kind of give them the tools and learn from everything that we see in this community of the critical tools that we need to understand potential pitfalls in the long term, to just have that open conversation and that power for the community to change things at all steps of the pipeline. I think learning how to do that in larger instances is a difficult task, but something that I think everyone here is definitely making progress in thinking about how to have that dialogue that we need to be having.
I think there's a couple of different epistemologies around kind of what is the project of taking on these systems, like speech recognition, facial recognition, different kinds of predictive analytics. As I look out with the scholars that I work with, there are people like Halcyon Lawrence, who's done incredible work around the lack of legibility of Black dialects and African dialects in speech recognition systems, and how Caribbean people in particular have to, and Southern Black people have to engage in like Herculean code switching efforts to be understood by these kinds of systems. And I highly recommend her work, Halcyon Lawrence. There are others who, and I think her position ultimately is that, of course, the databases of recognition are woefully insufficient, because these technologies do not think about the differences. Let's say that there actually could be differences among Black people, believe it or not. And so she has done really remarkable work here. I think of the work of people like my colleagues, Timnit Jabru, Debraji, Joy Bolamini, and their Gender Shades project, looking at the low efficacy for facial recognition on Black women's faces, and that facial recognition technologies work best on white men's faces and work least effectively on Black women's faces. And so when these systems are implemented, obviously there's an incredible amount of disparity that happens. And then I think of the work that's kind of more like mine and Ruha Benjamin, where our work might argue that what we don't want is better legibility by these systems. What we want is for these systems not to exist. And so there's a vast array of ways in which people take up these different kinds of technologies and think about strategies that should be employed around them. I think that prevailing, most well-funded logic is that we make these technologies better. We get better data sets, we do better training of algorithms, and we include more people so that there's a higher degree of accuracy. But, you know, I think at least in our center at UCLA, our position, and let's say our theory of change, is that we have to always have a power analysis about these types of technologies. Who owns them? Who owns the means to deploy them? Are they pointed toward? Who is precluded from various types of technologies? Who is protected from them? Who is unprotected? And our sensibility, I'll say mine certainly, is that we are, as publics, are constantly experimented upon. And unfortunately, the research community, I mean, we are some of the worst perpetrators of that experimentation under the auspices of research, and with funding from the public to support it, where there's very little consent by the public that they want these things, in fact. And if you are unfairly ensnared, let's say a facial recognition system flags you as a lawbreaker, you have very little recourse because we don't have a court system, we don't have enough case law yet, we don't have enough legislation for people to even have digital civil rights, which is probably the most important thing to me right now in my own work, is thinking about the landscape of repair and how will we defend ourselves from these kinds of technologies. So I think there are people who also think that an abolitionist perspective, which is to say, how do we take away these kinds of carceral technologies that ensnare us and limit human possibility, limit the possibility for transformation, for restoration, that don't work in just such punitive ways, kind of at their worst. And the trade-offs for like convenience, I mean, I find it incredibly inconvenient to be facially scanned to get into anything on an airplane, any of these things. And these get even more profoundly consequential for trans people, for people who are non-binary, for systems that do not read us in very explicit ways. So I think that those are the kinds of conversations that are really worth having right now, which is, do we want some of these things? If we don't want them, how do we, I love the way that, you know, you're talking about kind of platform, you know, kind of ecologies. Can we de-platform some of these? Can we decommission? Now we need our friend Lawrence Livermore to tell us, how do we decommission certain types of technologies? Because we know that once these things are made, you can be guaranteed that the most nefarious weaponization of them will in fact happen very, very quickly. And I think these are the kinds of things that are worth talking about right now.
Yes, I appreciate that segue into thinking about not just how do we improve these systems, but how do we eliminate the systems themselves. And also, Tony's mentioning about the ways that so many users now are becoming a lot more aware of the way that platforms work. I recently wrote an article about a topic that I call platform consciousness, that people are becoming very platform conscious, that we, you know, are past this point where, you know, Google recommends you something and it's like magic. Like, how did they know that about me? Now we all know how they know these things. And a lot of it is because there are these systems underlying these different platforms and tools that are actually collecting all this information and data about us. And so on one hand, I can definitely understand why you want to improve those systems, why we want to improve facial recognition, why we want to include more different communities when it comes to being able to study how people speak and the cultural lexicons of different groups. But something that I have really seen even more so is that there is not an interest in being legible to certain systems, especially when you are working with intersectionally marginalized communities. And for me, as somebody who works a lot with thinking about cultural productions, and also this impetus I've seen more recently in terms of cultural gatekeeping. So communities, in particular communities of color, in particular queer and trans communities, who want to keep their culture to themselves to some extent, who don't necessarily want everybody to be able to interpret their language or their practices or their ways of doing things, and especially not wanting that to be interpreted by a computer system. And it reminds me a lot of Ramon Amaro. He has a great essay called As If, which is thinking about why facial recognition software doesn't always work as well for certain communities. And he talks about the fact that a lot of the training data, of course, is not based on those communities. So of course you have those issues, but instead of viewing it as a problem, as something that needs to be solved, he actually really describes it as an opportunity to think about the concept of the Black technical object, to think about the ways that Black communities are able to evade recognition from outside, and how that allows them to actually be able to create community and culture for themselves in ways that are actually quite productive and also that are quite generative within the community itself. And this is something that we've seen a lot of right now within TikTok. Because TikTok has these censorship algorithms, something that you may have noticed if you use the site, and something I've written about very recently within my data science blog, is thinking about how users are actually doing counter-platforming strategies to get around the censorship algorithm on TikTok. So they're actually creating code words for different things that you're not allowed to say on TikTok. And we've seen that with Black communities in general when it comes to being able to have certain conversations within the public sphere that might not be allowed in some way. And so there are code words now for different types of social justice. There are code words now for people who are really invested in thinking about things like a trauma and domestic abuse and violence, and being able to have those conversations without the algorithm actually recognizing what it is that they're doing. And so I think that there is not just a conversation that we should have about, oh, let's make these systems better, let's be able to police and surveil people better, but actually to think about why might it be that people don't want to be surveilled. And especially in thinking about culture production, also thinking of the fact that many communities want to keep their culture and their content to themselves, in part so it doesn't get co-opted and taken and extracted as these data points. And so that's something that I want to see more of, and something that I do a lot of work with, is really thinking about not just how can we improve the system, but how can we also learn how to evade these systems and be able to actually keep certain types of cultural content to the communities who are creating those things, and not necessarily making it legible to everybody outside of those communities.
Thank you for that. I think that is definitely a interesting sort of perspective to do this. And if I understand, part of the question is really centered around how do we basically engage this sort of conversation around it. And I think part of it is raising as I said earlier, raising the awareness around it. It's happening on its own, quite frankly, just the way our technology is just basically progressing. And the education piece of those that are using it, those users that are using it today, because they're getting to understand it. And you're doing all this research that are basically centered and is talking about that. And I think our keynote basically hit on a very important aspect of this, in how to engage individuals to be part of the conversation. I thought it was cool that he really reached out to basically just community to try to understand what the conversation was happening and how that because he had some insight and awareness, but he needed more perspective. That's what we need, is really centered around making sure we have perspective along this sort of development process. And that perspective is from a broad community of folks. In this case, it was very specific because he really needed to understand, was he seeing what he thought he was seeing? And the sort of Twitter feed that was happening with this young lady, and I was like, man, that was innovative for you to actually think about that from that perspective. And that's what needs to happen in this space, is that we need to be very open and also creative to basically say, we don't know all the possible things that we think we know, and we're doing this from our own sort of perspective, research, and then as a result of that, what are we missing? And I think that's what the keynote said. I had to leave at the end, but I think that was one of the questions he had asked. What am I missing? And if you ask yourselves that simple question, that may lead to some additional insight for you as you basically move into this space. And it doesn't have to always be negative. It can be sort of positive in the sense that we're hoping gleaming information that is potentially useful and can help the community at large as well. And I think that's where we're trying to focus in on at our laboratory is how can we effectively get these different perspectives of thought around certain things that we basically are trying to do. And those thoughts lead to ideas and innovation. And that's what we're all about, is trying to really innovate for the greater good as much as we can, even though I know that some folks don't know all the things that we do at our lab. They only think about one thing, but we do a lot of different things at our laboratory.
Thank you. Certainly a very inspiring comment. I do want to follow this line of discussion because I really like Safiya's analysis of using power, right, to understand technology. And indeed, when we think about who has the power, a lot of these technological corporations, right, they are actually, sort of controlling, the deployment of these technologies. But whereas in reality, where you look at what they optimize for short-term profits, right? So they look at earning costs, right? They look at, how do I make the earning cost looks good? So what they do is that, when there's a discussion about, let's say, DEI, or there's discussion about, profit for this quarter, they always go to, how do I increase traffic and how do I go for the profit? So with this fundamental conflict, right, between business model and also technology, what do you think, right, we can do to change and actually do better in the future?
I'll jump in on this one because I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Part of the challenge is that we have major corporations that have taken over kind of the research apparatus with us by extension. And so let me give you an example. NSF partners with Amazon, and the conditions upon which we try to do large-scale, let's say, data science kinds of projects ultimately benefit Amazon, right? This is a big announcement a few years ago. If we are doing research, we are reliant upon using Amazon, Microsoft, Google, web infrastructures, right? And so no matter what we're engaged in these different projects, our own research really helps to develop these companies' technologies too. And I can tell you here in California, in the UC system, we now only get 4% of our funding for the University of California system from the state legislature, which means that we are incredibly reliant, and by we, I mean our administrators, are incredibly reliant upon corporate funding and private donors to make the university go, which creates the perfect conditions for companies to come into, especially engineering, information, data science programs in schools, and offer resources. So they kind of cherry pick the researchers that are favorable to the kinds of things that they're interested in knowing more about. And they are often outsourcing the riskiest dimensions of their R&D to the public by having NSF, NIH, and other public agencies underwrite the cost of the risky experimentation. So we have a whole kind of ecosystem here that really is undergirding the question that you're asking about the business model, which often is further down the line in the relationship between consumers and these companies or B2B engagements. But really, I think so much in the context of what we all do is how do we also respond to these conditions that ultimately leave us in the least optimal space to do critical research, quite frankly, to ask hard questions of these kinds of research models. and also provide resources for us to do something else. My feeling is that part of the challenge, I mean, here we are in California, and you would think that we would have the most robust, probably even better funding in this state for research around technology and society and all the kinds of things that we care about, because we have the tax base of Silicon Valley, Silicon Beach, and all the Silicon corridors in California. We should have, in fact, more money probably than the federal government when you really think about where these companies originate and where they're headquartered. And yet, here we are in incredibly precarious kinds of institutions, public institutions, private institutions, creating more favorable conditions. Now I'm digging on Stanford because I can't help myself. So I think these are, it's like we have good critiques of the business models. We understand the kind of the political economy of how the companies work in society. We have less power so far in organizing ourselves as faculty, as students, as researchers to one, appeal to the state legislature and really help them understand that when they not only don't fund public education and public universities, they create more opportunity for companies to kind of get what their needs met at the expense of the public, but they also have to create some type of tax system, a system of taxation for the Valley and for tech companies. I mean, we're talking about 7 of the 10 most well-capitalized companies on planet Earth are tech companies. It's just ludicrous that they would not pay into the system and then create, through the precarity of what we don't have because we don't have the resources, they create the conditions of business opportunity. And this, of course, is how we know that we have Google running our entire IT backbone in the University of California, for example. So I think that is part of like what we have to think about. Now, I know that we aren't unionized in the UC like the CSU, but we certainly should be working in much greater partnership. We are the people who can actually articulate the stakes to our colleagues outside of this room in other fields. And we have the expertise of humanists and social scientists to help us understand what those stakes are in society. And I think we have to be doing much more to kind of articulate, make the connection, do the lobbying, and advocate for the public, because it's a really important dimension of solving some of these problems.
I'll add to the fact that what she mentioned about partnering. And one of the things that we're taking on is actually partnering with these companies. So that helps it won't play into the notion about the dollars that you're talking about, but hopefully in the awareness and education for them. We basically just started an incubator, I think back in December, AI3, with NVIDIA, IBM, and Google, I believe. And there's other industry partners as well, but it's all centered around applied science and trying to get them engaged in that sort of understanding. Obviously, with high performance computing being a sort of background to that. And what we want to try and do is see how we can work collaboratively together on some of these important challenges and problems that face our universe today. And if we can do that, I don't try to be Pollyanna. It's not going to change the dollar figure piece that you're talking about. But my dream, I guess, or our hope is that we will influence some conversation and thought perspective that can be different than just the dollars. That's a hope. I know it's a high dream, but it is something that I tend to really hold on to is our humanity as much as possible. And we need that. We need that in this space in addition to all the things we do. And I think there are some people who are working in those companies that we're talking about that still have their humanity as a part of it. And they're not necessarily after all the dollars per se. you know, a lot of them know are leaving and going to crypto right now, but, you know, I still want to have faith in the fact that they have that interest. And they signed up to say that they wanted to collaborate with us and be part of this incubator. So I think those individuals that aren't necessarily at that top worry about the profit piece, they actually care about the actual research that is going on. So I'm going to be hopeful that those individuals understand what it means for them to be doing this work and doing it in a way that I hope is ethical and sound.
I think also to the point that you were mentioning right now is incredibly important is that the bigger changes in incentive structures are going to happen with community engagement. And if it's the case that big tech is entrenched in making such a communication or a coordinated effort to engage the community to change these incentive structures, that's one of the key things that we need to be thinking about how to break. And I think this goes back to this common theme that we've been talking about, and this pedagogical theme of how do we teach. I mean, it's great to hear that there's more interest at the grassroots level for how these algorithms are working and how and that there's this grassroots interest in what's going on inside of the black box. But then the bigger question is, how do we supplement that, and how do we bypass this shadow looming of which, I mean, on one hand, we have the financial structures, which is a big part, and that's, of course, difficult to break. But I guess maybe the question that I make to the panel is, are there other ways beyond the financial structures that we can help engage community and empower them to fight back, to take more ownership over the technological structures that feed into the power of big tech? I mean, I think this also has to do a lot with Faithe, you were mentioning, and I found this incredibly interesting, about people wanting identity ownership in these platforms online. And I think that how can we help keep these local identities, empower these identities, and teach and learn from them how we can collectively fight back against this larger shadow of the structure that we're entrenched in. And I think it begins at mobilizing our communities and taking advantage of these very communities that have that desire and that new awareness to have this digital ownership as well.
Great. So I think right now, if you have questions in the audience, please feel free to line up by these two microphones. We're also very happy to take audience questions for the panel to address. And meanwhile, I want to check if Sharon has any questions.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I was thinking about as you all were talking and is the fact that we need something similar to what happened with Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. So we need a digital Underground Railroad, so to speak, in order to really get to some of these answers. Because the way that we are being surveilled, the way that we depend upon technology, the way that we, I would say, engage it in our everyday lives, it's going to be really tough to come up with some of those things that you all were talking about in terms of the coded language that Dr. Day mentioned around these issues. I had a conversation with someone literally just yesterday around, a lot of people don't want their pictures up on YouTube or TikTok or up on Instagram, but yet and still when you're in public spaces, that's not an option that you have. So now we even have a ring, when someone comes to push a button, right? That takes your pictures. You walk by their house and they have a camera inside, again, their doorbell. What do we do with these kind of situations? We depend upon them. We use them. But yet at the same time, there's that internal conflict. There's that dialogue that happens within these conflicting dialogues that happen between our use of them independence, and then also the lack of presence and knowledge and these diverse epistemologies within that space. So I would like maybe for at least someone to address that issue, considering that every single one of us use our cell phones, knowing that we're being surveilled, use all these different technologies. Our cars now are using AI. So how do we deal with this issue when we become so dependent upon it? Because it's easy to say, put your phones down. Don't buy any surveillance technology, because everything that we use now is surveillance. So how do we manage to actually navigate this system and come up with a type of underground railroad kind of process? Thank you.
Well, I love this question. I don't know if you knew, Sharon, but I'm wearing my patron saint, Harriet Tubman necklace right now. And I think about what it means to be a teacher, for example, and try to inspire students to think about being liberated from some of these technologies. Part of it, I think, is like on the first day we talk about, do you know what the learning management system is? Do you know how it surveils you? I always ask the question, how many of you know that your instructors can log in and see the last time you logged into the Blackboard or the Moodle or whatever it is you're using? Of course, no hands go up because they have no idea that that's happening. And just revealing all the systems that touch them in the university that we force them into is an effective way of helping make visible what these systems are. But then we also have choices to, and I agree with you, this kind of localized, local context of what these systems are trying to push back. So, we don't have to use Turnitin. We don't have to do all the things that is recommended to us. And I think that we should push back on those things. I know I do. And so you can imagine I'm terribly popular with the administration with some of the things that I don't do. But I think these things are important, even to the degree that I will ask my students to handwrite in journals, try to go off the grid for a weekend. All the things they have to think of like, how am I going to eat in the res hall? Like, how am I going to, without swiping, like, how am I going to live? But making those things visible in these very banal ways is extremely important, because it does give people a chance to see like what we're constantly being forced to trade off and where we can't withdraw our participation. Because, it's kind of like people have a critique of capitalism, but they still got to pay the rent. They still got to pay a bill, and they need money to do it. So I don't think that there will be a solution at the individual level. I think these are systems, structural responses that we have to have. But I want us to remember that things like bans on facial recognition happen in local communities. Those are hyper-local kinds of organizing responses that are effective. And I don't think everything has to be like federal legislation. I think there's also cultural response, that we create the conditions. I mean, who would have ever thought we'd be living in the era of like a techlash that was really strong until COVID-19 hit and everybody had to get on this platform they hadn't heard of called Zoom. But here we are with different kinds of cultural markers about what we're really doing. And it's such an incredible time to be doing this work because so many things are legible. I really appreciate your work there. So I don't know, that's my response. I just think we have to we can't just make it the kind of neoliberal, it's on you by yourself response to get your rights and to get your protections. We have to think about how we will pass laws, pass policies in our institutions, and work together on those issues.
And I think another thing that this conference, this get-together is really well suited to also think about is to think about academic structures more broadly and how they fall into this space. And things, I come at this a little bit more, well, I guess as someone more junior thinking about going into the becoming a faculty member and thinking about the metrics that are used for faculty for getting tenure. We had a very interesting discussion yesterday about behind the scenes about creating new data science departments and what the incentive structures there being made. And we have so many conflicting things here. We have the funding that's coming from big tech. We have the metrics and perhaps like what the old guard might be seeing. And thinking about the fact that one thing that I believe is crucial is this interdisciplinary work that talks with communities, that is in perpetual contact. It doesn't necessarily fall into the typical molds of the metrics that one might be in terms of putting a tenure case in all institutions, let's say. And so changing that academic structure is something that we can think about here in terms of the fight back. And there have been some really interesting efforts. I know that I've been personally involved with a new ACM conference on equity and access and algorithms, mechanisms, and optimization, EMO. And so creating new conferences, new publishing venues, this new space for this being a valid or perceiving, so that people can perceive this area of research as valid for these milestones that one searches for is really important. I think a conversation that I'm glad that this is being brought up because everyone here can really help to move things in that direction. And this will definitely trickle down into future students and those communities that they come from and the research and the funding that will eventually come from when there is more awareness into this, into the validity of this area of research. And it's an exciting time in that sense. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, great. I think we have a question.
I'm a runner.
Here.
I'm just running the microphone.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much for the panelists discuss this very important critical issue that definitely help raise awareness of this among the data scientists here. I want to say, so we get to the awareness of these vulnerable communities and would like to engage and help and in some way. Do you guys have any tips or recommendations for data scientists how to establish some trustable connections with the community we are discussing, and especially from like someone from outside of this community? How do we develop this kind of relationship? Is there anything we need to pay particular attention to maintain this kind of relationship?
I would say that you need to build connections and basically continue to engage those communities that you want to be talking with and working with, quite frankly, because they should be involved as part of it. And also uplifting yourself and your own knowledge and awareness and education around the people and the culture. That should be part of your responsibility, quite frankly, in trying to understand what it is. I know one of the things that we do, just to be specific, is that, for example, at UC Riverside and UC Merced, we are basically working with a cohort of about 22 students, basically, the majority of those students are undergrads, and then 4 of them are grads. And they basically, the 4 grads, oversee 4 groups of those students, one each. And we have them explore all the things that we're talking about, from basically starting a project along these lines and engaging them in that. So one we did, for example, was centered around machine learning to identify basically potential hazardous asteroids that could pose an existential sort of threat to humanity. And the students basically worked on that with our mentors, worked on that with not only those in machine learning data science, but also in astronomy and other areas. So there's this relationship that we were building with this cohort of students, and it's only for 2 to 3 weeks. And really what we did was take that learning experience and then move those students into an internship. And what ended up happening, which was really neat, was the graduate students ended up coming as a higher when they finished their PhD into the laboratory as part of that process, but they went back to basically be the mentors for those students in the undergraduate program. So we were trying to build this sort of community of students that basically were involved in learning all aspects of data science. And we were teaching them, all of them, that aspect of really how do you basically understand how to do this work and do that work by connecting with people. So not only the science piece, but connecting with the people. And that's what we're doing with the students, is connecting with them. So you can start small with some sort of program centered around that, and then see how you can scale it and move forward. We did that at supercomputing as well, is really build a program centered around broadening the engagement of folks, and then sort of seeing if we can scale it. So we started small and just scaling it from there. So that's how I would do it. I don't know what the colleagues, this seems to be working for us. We want to expand, and been talking to Sharon about that for Santa Barbara and us engaging in that process with our Data Science Institute. We're just focused in on UC for right now, with the exception of maybe working with Florida A&M University in this regard as well. So we're trying to figure out if we can scale this kind of model that we're doing.
I think case studies of repair are really, really important and powerful to train data scientists. So for example, with data science students who take my courses, I will give them a very deep lesson on things like redlining, the history of redlining in the United States, and how that process has become digitized to the point that we had the mortgage crisis triggered by the gamification of financial markets, the algorithmic gamification, in such a way that the redlining and the discrimination was made so opaque, people really didn't realize that the mortgage crisis was the greatest wipeout of Black wealth in the history of the United States. All the gains of Reconstruction, all the gains of the Civil Rights Movement effectively wiped out. And if you understand the history of redlining and you understand how redlining becomes a datafied process, such that by the time the data scientist inherits a data set, they have no idea about that history. They're just looking at raw data. They cannot read those histories into it. Then they're in no position to try to imagine what the repair should be or could be, what the possibilities of it. Or they might take that data and have a historical analysis or social analysis of it and think, oh, well, maybe the repair for the future is that we design algorithms that distribute the risk equally, rather than there should be no risk whatsoever to the public, right? So these are frames, and these framing exercises for me are really powerful in teaching my computer science, data science, information science students, even the theater students. You know, they care about these issues because they're trying to make sense of their, the world. And I think this is where data science education often fails data science students and professionals, because there's such an emphasis on the end result of like any data set, any free data set in particular that we can get our hands on. And that is just deeply insufficient. And this is where I think, the efforts that, Jackie's doing at Dartmouth and like all that Sharon's doing at Santa Barbara, all of these different like interdisciplinary efforts to bring Black studies, ethnic studies, gender studies, sociology, humanities into dialogue with the social construction of data. What is it? What is the data? And why do we think that we're doing science on it? Even opening up those questions and having that be a regular long-term part of the way data science programs are deployed is so, so powerful, and I think it would be transformative for the field.
I think I would also like to say, thinking about diversity at large, because I think this touches upon the importance of having that forum, that means of community. It facilitates and that facilitates the potential of working with these communities. And there are some really small things that can already happen in the academic space that really go a long ways in terms of pushing for a space that's open to individuals from different backgrounds. And I speak to this a little bit from the perspective of having helped organize certain academic conferences, but things like language translation, simultaneous language translation from people from other countries. This allows that barrier of language, of people to come in from different marginalized communities from around the world and to give that perspective in what they're, and then that is the first step in terms of building a team that has that ability to communicate with people from different backgrounds and to be able to collectively come together to a project that is for the benefit of the community. And so I think that it's important to think about, maybe take a step back and think about how are we preparing our researchers and our students. And I think about this because I have more experience in this academic context, but in that space to make it more welcoming and to have us just be more conditioned to be open to those collaborations and to be learning from people from many different backgrounds, because that is ultimately what helps give us a different frame of reference in terms of because you were talking about specific projects that we could work on, about knowledge of specific projects and about being able to just have the right context on how to deal with the people in these communities too.
Thank you. Great, we have a question here.
Hello, I have a question regarding data classification and feature engineering. So for example, working with US Census data, going far enough back, you can really see there's bias in how we classify citizens and with ethnicity and race. And my question would be, do you feel like there has been improvements in how we classify our public policy data? Do you feel optimistic about changes coming through, or is there a lot of improvements that you'd like to see?
Anyone?
That one's tough.
There's no question that discriminatory kinds of data are, especially as you go back. I wrote a whole chapter on this in my book about this in library contexts of data and knowledge classification, right? That we used to use, and by we, I mean the big we, not me, used to use these phrases like, the Negro problem or the Jewish problem or, yellow peril as a way of describing Black people, Jewish people, Asian Americans. So we know that these histories exist, and one of the questions that librarians often ask me is, how do we engage with this? Like, how do we go back and use the terms of today, the terms of art, to reclassify that knowledge, or do we have metadata to describe what those terms are, so that we can have the knowledge of kind of how racism, for example, in our society was described and articulated, and what it foreclosed. And I think those are really interesting, important questions. We definitely have this around LGBTQIA+ identity. This is the amazing books. Melissa Adler wrote a great book about this. Again, kind of how do we reclassify data, or should we? And I think there's many different points of view on what the right things are to do, but certainly that we are in a position to be able to destabilize the alleged stability of categories is really important, because it allows us, again, to think about what would be reparative with different kinds of classification. So for example, in race, a lot of people think that we should no longer keep categorizing knowledge, right, or research by race. And there are many arguments around this that reinforces the instability of the kind of racial hierarchy of race, because race is a power system. It's not actually ethnicity. Race is a power system. But yet we can't get NIH funding or NSF funding unless we disseminate back and clarify how we are doing research on different kinds of racial categories. So these are systems questions, but I think we have the intelligence to kind of think through what's the real point here. It's not just this kind of stability or instability of the category. It's like, to what ends can we use these classifiers to help us achieve more just outcomes with communities? And with, if we don't, for example, collect data on race, we defund initiatives that are about trying to, let's say, protect civil rights or the denial of civil rights of the past. So those things are complex to me. I don't think there's an either or answer. I think it's very contextual, and I would argue that the researchers be incredibly aware of like what the project is and how those classifiers can actually help bring justice to or support to communities that have been historically discriminated against. That's really, I think, it's the value system underneath the classification systems.
Thank you. So we are right at an hour mark. So we want to really thank the ETSA team, Michaela, for really getting us together for this wonderful conversation. I want to thank my co-chair, Professor Sharon Tettegah, for organizing the panel. I want to thank each one of you for this very inspirational panel. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can't wait for these